I would like to thank all of you for your support this year, and I know that many of you have been watching the channel since the beginning in 2018. Your support is very much appreciated. A special thank you to all of my wonderful channel members whose names appear here. I am generally very grateful to you all. Today, we will be looking at 4 cases from the 19th century, so sit back, as for case number 1, we go to Wales. Mary Prout was born on the 12th of January 1843 in Amroth, a small village located in the county of Pembrokeshire, in the southwestern part of Wales. It was an idyllic place, known for its picturesque landscapes, beautiful sandy beaches, and coastal pathways. However, although Amroth was a beautiful place, life for the poor in the mid-19th century was difficult. The scenic landscape masked the harsh realities faced by many of its inhabitants. The fishing industry, a primary source of livelihood, was unpredictable and often perilous. Agricultural labourers toiled long hours for meagre wages, and the remote location limited access to markets and medicine. The women in particular faced a challenging existence, often confined to poorly paid domestic roles in the homes of wealthier families. Their days were filled with arduous tasks, such as cooking and cleaning and tending to the children, leaving little time for themselves. Despite the natural beauty surrounding them, many endured a life of hard work and constant struggle. Mary was one of 6 children and received very little schooling. In the 1840s, education was not compulsory in Wales and consisted mainly of charity schools, Sunday schools, and education provided by religious organisations, all of which usually only taught rudimentary instruction in reading, writing and arithmetic. Instead of going to school, when children were about 8 years old, they were sent to work in order to financially contribute to the household. Mary worked in domestic service and by all accounts grew into a polite and hard-working young woman. However, in 1863, she discovered that she was with child. In 1860s Wales, a pregnant young unmarried woman who worked in domestic service faced more than the perceived personal misfortune. Employers were bound by high standards of respectability and could not tolerate any lapse in moral conduct within their households. Pregnancy outside marriage was met with severe judgments, and the unfortunate woman was usually dismissed in order to preserve the household's reputation and adhere to the prevailing codes of propriety. When Mary's employer discovered that she was pregnant, she was told that she would no longer be required and that she would have to leave the house. While most unmarried women would turn to their families for support in such difficult times, Mary found herself unable to do so. Her mother had passed away 2 years earlier, and her father, having remarried, distanced himself from her. Neither he nor his new wife were willing to bring the shame of an unmarried pregnant daughter into their home. With nowhere else to turn, she was forced to seek refuge at the workhouse. She was just 21 years old, and now had to confront the grim realities of institutional life. The workhouse was known for its harsh conditions and strict regulations, but now would become her new unforgiving environment, as she faced the challenges of both her recent dismissal and impending motherhood. On the 9th of April 1864, just 2 months after arriving at the Narberth workhouse, Mary gave birth to a baby, who she named Rhoda, after one of her sisters who had died a few months earlier. Although life in the workhouse was far from easy, Mary adapted to her harsh circumstances with remarkable resilience. She was regarded as an obedient inmate and described as civil and orderly. She was grateful for the shelter and basic care that the workhouse provided for her and her baby. Yet her situation took a sudden turn in the middle of May, when the Board of Guardians discovered that she had a grandmother, a widowed lady named Mrs. Anne Prout, who could potentially provide her with a place to live, and they told Mary that she must leave. This was due to the institution's stringent regulations, which aimed to reduce costs by placing the responsibility of care on family members wherever possible. That often meant the removal of less vulnerable inmates to make room for those in greater need. Mary did not want to bring the shame of having a baby out of wedlock into her grandmother's home, but she knew that she would have to leave the workhouse. So on Friday the 20th of May, she set off on foot bound for Summerhill, a collection of a few houses, a short distance northwest of Amroth. She departed late in the afternoon, hoping to arrive at her grandmother's house by the evening. She was carrying her baby and would have to walk a distance of some 7 miles. It was not only the physical toll of the journey that troubled her, but also the anxiety about the reception she would receive when she was back in the village. Around 8 p.m, on the path leading from the high road towards Colby and Amroth Church, Mary encountered Mrs. Hannah Davis and her daughter. Mary recognised them both, and Mrs. Davis paused to admire the baby. After exchanging pleasantries, Mrs. Davis continued on her way, but her daughter lingered for a few moments to chat with Mary. They spoke briefly about the walk from Narberth, which gave Mary a little time to rest her legs. Before going to her grandmother's house, Mary stopped by the house of Susan Ebsworth, a relative who offered nursing services for children. Eventually, she knocked on her grandmother's door. Mrs. Anne Prout opened it and greeted her granddaughter. She noted that Mary looked pale, weak and very tired. Her clothes were dishevelled and her eyes reflected the strain of her arduous journey. However, Mary had arrived alone. Her baby was not with her. With a mix of worry and confusion, Mary's grandmother quickly ushered her inside and asked anxiously about the fate of her little daughter. On the verge of collapsing, Mary struggled to find the words to explain, her heart heavy and tears welling in her eyes. With great difficulty, she told her grandmother that the baby had died. When Mrs. Prout inquired about when this happened, Mary replied that the baby had passed away the previous Tuesday and that she had not seen her since. Mary also mentioned that the funeral would take place the following day. Mrs. Prout looked at her granddaughter, and despite her own shock and grief, she said, "Do not cry, Mary. Go down on your knees and give thanks to God for taking her." It was now late, so Mary and her grandmother went to bed. The next day, Mary got up early, ate a little breakfast, and announced that she was going to see her sister, who lived in a neighbouring village. However, when walking through Amroth, people noticed that Mary had not got her baby with her. There had been much local gossip when Mary had found herself to be in the unfortunate position of being pregnant and unmarried, and despite pressure from her family, had refused to name the father. Now the absence of her baby raised even more questions. Mrs. Davis had already informed some villagers that she had seen Mary with her little daughter, walking towards her grandmother's house on the previous day, and this only deepened the mystery surrounding the infant's whereabouts. On the evening of Sunday the 22nd of May, PC Peter Royal received information that the baby of Mary Prout had not been seen since Mrs. Hannah Davis had stumbled across Mary and her little daughter on the path leading from the high road towards Colby and Amroth Church on the previous Friday. The constable decided to investigate the area to see what he could find. Accompanied by 2 miners, named William Davies and John Davies, they searched around the fields and hedges, but found nothing. Knowing that there were several coal pits in the vicinity, they went to the nearest one, which was at Killanow, just a short distance from where Mrs. Davis had seen Mary 2 days previously. The 2 miners descended into the pits, and a few minutes later, William Davies emerged holding the lifeless body of a baby girl. Shocked and stunned, the 3 men paused, absorbing the weight of their discovery. They looked at each other, trying to come to terms with the seriousness of the situation. When they had regained their composure, they carried the body to the police station and informed the commanding officer. The next morning at 4 a.m, Thomas Kelly, the superintendent of Pembrokeshire, arrived at the home of Mrs. Anne Prout and charged her granddaughter, Miss Mary Prout, with murder. An inquest was opened on Tuesday the 24th of May at Saundersfoot, a village about 6 miles from Amroth. It was held in front of W.V. James Esquire. Witnesses included Mrs. Hannah Davis and her daughter, P.C. Royal, and William Davies, who had found the body. Pembrokeshire Superintendent Thomas Kelly told the inquest that when he arrested Miss Prout, she was very quiet and did not speak. But later she said, "I'll tell the truth if they hang me. I threw it in and ran away a short distance, then returned and found there was no noise." He added that the confession was quite voluntary. The physician who conducted the autopsy, Dr. Thomas Henry Newsom, told the inquest that in his opinion, the baby had died from a fractured skull. There was also a fracture on the left thigh and discoloration of the left knee. but he added that the child was well fed, her stomach was full of milk, and her intestines and lungs were healthy in appearance. He went on to say that he saw nothing to make him believe that the death had occurred naturally. The inquest found Mary Prout guilty of murder, and she was held in custody to await her trial. On Wednesday the 13th of July 1864, at the Summer Assizes in Haverfordwest, the county town of Pembrokeshire, Mary Prout pleaded not guilty to the charge of wilful murder of her daughter. She was represented by Mr. Thomas Allen. Although many of the witnesses were the same as those who had given testimony at the inquest, this time Mr. Allen was able to cross-examine them. When cross-examining Dr. Thomas Henry Newsom, Mr. Allen asked about the presence of red gum in the baby, a common Victorian term for a mild eruption on the baby's neck, often caused by poor quality milk. Dr. Newsom acknowledged that this condition could cause irritation and, if severe, might lead to convulsions. However, he emphasised that on examining the body, the red gum did not appear very severe. Mr. Allen then suggested that the baby might have indeed suffered convulsions and died in her mother's arms. Overcome by grief and panic, Mary could then have thrown the child into the pit. Mr. Allen asked Mr. Newsom if he had known the defendant for a while. The doctor confirmed that he had, and said that she had always been good-natured. Mr. Allen then asked the doctor if he had ever considered her to be of unsound mind. The doctor responded that he had not. Several witnesses testified to Mary's good character. Martha Williams, the workhouse matron, described her as very civil, and Esther Thomas, who had shown much kindness to Mary at the workhouse and had given her a cap for her little daughter as she thought that the baby was not thriving well, confirmed that Mary was attentive to her child and seemed generally fond of her. In fact, it was stated that when Mary was told that she must leave the workhouse, she requested a few hours from her duties so she could go to her grandmother's house and collect clothes for the baby. Her defence suggested that this action showed Mary's intention to care for her child and did not indicate a motive to harm her. Mary's grandmother, Mrs. Anne Prout, was called to the stand. She told the court how Mary had always cared for her baby, but also mentioned a family history of mental illness. She said that her own mother was considered peculiar and that her sister-in-law named Sarah Prout had once run away from the house in a state of undress. She added that when Sarah was escorted back, she was still not wearing any clothes. The grandmother went on to speak about her aunts Mary and Betsy, who both exhibited strange behaviours and often had to have their hands tied to prevent them from harming themselves. She added that Aunt Mary once climbed a ladder and refused to come down, and that eventually the poor woman was committed to a lunatic asylum where she lived until her death. When the defence made their closing statements, Mr. Allen addressed the jury for a considerable length of time, and with notable skill. He presented 3 key points for their consideration. Firstly, did the child leave the workhouse alive? Secondly, did the child arrive at the pit's mouth alive? And thirdly, if they considered that the prisoner threw the child down the pit, and he did not deny that she did, was the prisoner in her right mind at that moment? He elaborated on these points extensively, aiming to highlight that Mary would be entitled to any benefit of doubt. The judge then summarised the evidence before the jury retired. After an hour's deliberation, they returned with a verdict of guilty with a recommendation for mercy, as they did not think that the crime was premeditated, and they believed that there was a history of insanity in Mary's family. However, despite the jury's recommendation for mercy, Miss Mary Prout was sentenced to be hanged. The sentence was appealed, and a petition was initiated by the local community, which rapidly generated the backing of over 1,000 people. This growing wave of support highlighted the widespread belief that Mary deserved leniency. The petition was presented to the High Sheriff, who was asked to request that the Home Secretary look on the case favourably. At the beginning of September, her sentence was commuted to 20 years transportation. But Mary was not transported. Instead, her sentence was later commuted to 20 years of incarceration. She did not serve the full term. In 1877, due to good behaviour, she received a conditional licence and was sent to a government-supported women's refuge. This arrangement allowed her to work and transition back into society. She was eventually released on the 23rd of May 1878, exactly 14 years since being arrested on the charge of killing her daughter. Mary returned to Pembrokeshire and later married Mr. James Rees, a gentleman 24 years her senior and now a widower, following the death of his wife 6 years earlier. There was some speculation that he might have been the father of Mary's illegitimate child. However, acknowledging such a relationship in 1864 would have severely tarnished his reputation, as society at the time held strict moral standards and judged harshly those involved in scandals or extramarital affairs. They went on to have 2 sons, who grew up and went to live in London. When Mary's husband James Rees died and Mary became a widow, she joined them. Mary Prout died in 1914 at the age of 71. After her death, her sons brought her body back to Amroth, where she was buried in the local churchyard, the same churchyard where her daughter Rhoda had been interred 50 years earlier.
For case number 2, we go to Canada.
Phoebe McWayne was born in 1847 into a modest family who had a small farm in the close-knit community of Thorndale in Middlesex County in the province of Ontario in Canada. She was the 3rd child, an only daughter, born to Mr. Joseph McWayne and his wife Mary Ann. Sadly, in 1855, tragedy had struck the McWayne household when the youngest child, a little boy named John, died at just 2 years old. At the time, the child mortality rate in Canada for children under the age of 5 was 310 deaths per 1,000 births. Phoebe had some schooling, although it was not until 1871, when the Ontario School Act was passed, that attendance became compulsory for children between the ages of 8 and 14. She would also help her parents and was considered to be a hard worker. She was often seen in the fields, assisting her father, or other times doing chores in the house. And although life was sometimes hard for such a young girl, Phoebe was always known to be polite and courteous, and people often commented on her pleasant character. 1860s Ontario saw a transition from subsistence farming to more organised and commercial methods. This was assisted by improved transportation networks, notably the expansion of the railways, which enabled farmers to gain access to broader markets and allowed for increased trade of crops and livestock. Technological advancements, such as the introduction of mechanical reapers and improved ploughing equipment, enhanced productivity and reduced labour intensity. Furthermore, the establishment of agricultural societies facilitated the spread of knowledge through publications and fairs, which aided the sharing of innovative practices. This pivotal decade laid the groundwork for Ontario's agrarian prosperity, which resulted in a period of notable expansion and advancement in the province's agricultural industry. When Phoebe was 20 years old, she married Mr. George Campbell, a hard-working and earnest young man who had grown up on a neighbouring farm. He was 8 years her senior and married Phoebe against the advice of his father. The McWaynes had an unenviable reputation, and George's family were not pleased that he was marrying Mr. and Mrs. McWayne's only daughter. George ignored the advice of his family, and following the wedding, the couple settled into a simple farmhouse on the outskirts of Thorndale, where they began building a life together. During this era, the rural communities in Ontario were tightly knit, and daily life often revolved around agriculture and family. Community gatherings, local events, and religious services were pivotal in maintaining social connections and contributed to the fabric of Thorndale's social life, helping to build and sustain communities. In the summer months, Phoebe and George worked hard. The days were long, often accompanied by brilliant sunshine. The fields were full of crops, and the banks full of lush vegetation and vibrant flowers. But winters in Ontario were harsh. As temperatures dropped, the snow covered the landscape, as farmers faced a series of daunting tasks to ensure their survival and that of their communities. Before winter took hold, crops had to be harvested and stored, livestock cared for and sheltered, and provisions stockpiled. However, despite the formidable challenges, Phoebe always demonstrated remarkable perseverance, and this was shown in her ability to adapt to situations, work tirelessly for hours, and support her husband. Over the next 4 years, Phoebe gave birth to 2 children, a girl named Mary Ann, and a boy named David. But life was tough for Phoebe. She had to look after her children, alongside the relentless chores of cooking, cleaning, and homemaking, while supporting her husband's labours. But she rarely complained, and it looked to those who knew them that she provided unwavering dedication to her family, especially when things were not going well. However, beneath the surface of domestic tranquility, cracks began to appear in Phoebe and George's marriage. Financial struggles weighed heavily on the couple, as their modest farm yielded inconsistent crops and meagre profits. As the pressures of rural life took their toll, disagreements turned into heated arguments. Despite this, they were able to maintain appearances in front of family and friends, and Phoebe especially managed to balance public perception and personal turmoil all the time, becoming even more disenchanted with her situation. As the summer of 1871 dawned, tensions between Phoebe and George increased. Their arguments grew more frequent, which left Phoebe feeling trapped in a life that had held so much promise. Rumours had also started to circulate that she was conducting an improper relationship with a young farmhand named Thomas Coyle, who worked for her father. These rumours were always denied by Phoebe. On the morning of the 15th of July, the village of Thorndale awoke to the terrible news that Mr. George Campbell was dead, apparently murdered in front of his wife and children. There was abundant gossip and hearsay as people recounted the story that Mrs. Phoebe Campbell had told the authorities about the tragic events that had unfolded within the confines of her own home. In Phoebe's statement, she said that as her family slept, an abrupt intrusion shattered the tranquility of the night as two black men, wearing dark clothes, entered their log cabin. The intruders targeted her husband, Mr. George Campbell, and demanded money. She said that George told them that he had none. Undeterred, the assailants then attempted to fire a gun. She presumed that they did this as a means of intimidation, but each time they tried to fire, the gun jammed. She went on to say that amidst the tension, George shouted to her to fetch the axe, which she did, only to have it taken from her by one of the assailants. She said that she then got the knife that was kept on top of the bureau, but this was wrestled away from her by the other man. They then both started to attack George. Mrs. Campbell then described how during this confrontation, her husband succumbed to the unrelenting blows from the axe, and he fell to the floor. She told of how she could see blood coming from the cuts in his head. She said that the attackers then hurriedly left, warning her not to leave the log cabin until the morning, or she too would face the same fate as her husband. She went on to say that as soon as they had gone, she went outside screaming for help and went in the direction of the nearest neighbour. Luckily her cries were heard, and Mr. Hugh MacDonald, whose farm was adjacent to the Campbells, came to see what was happening. It was early, between 1:30 and 2 a.m, and he was soon joined by neighbours William Blackmore and Richard Craig. The three men saw George lying on the floor and realised that he was dead. Mrs. Phoebe Campbell added that the gentlemen were very helpful and managed to provide a semblance of comfort during this terrible ordeal. Over the next few days, this tale was recounted throughout Thorndale and the surrounding area, and although it seemed that everyone initially believed Phoebe's version of the events, there were those who began to wonder if this was actually what had happened. The two black men who she had claimed had killed her husband had disappeared, and the authorities had not been able to find witnesses who could say that they had seen them on the days preceding or following the murder. Although in the beginning it had seemed like a straightforward murder case, it now began to look more complex. It had also been noted that during George's funeral, an unsettling sense of detachment seemed to envelop Phoebe. The absence of a visibly emotional response raised eyebrows and was one of the main conversations between those who were in attendance. It was one of George's relatives, Miss Annie Campbell, who provided the authorities with the clue about this puzzling behaviour. While she acknowledged fleeting instances of sorrow, Annie had noticed that Phoebe didn't look as upset as one might think she would have, considering the fatal attack on her husband that happened right in front of her and her children. A lady named Mrs. Mary Freed also told the police that she had seen Phoebe meeting Thomas Coyle in a field near the log cabin on the evening after the murder. This caught people's attention, especially because there had previously been rumours that the two might have been conducting an improper relationship. However, the most confusing element of this tragic event was why Phoebe had remained helpless during the violent assault on her husband. The fact that she did not intervene, seek assistance, or raise the alarm during the attack left many in the community confused and somewhat uneasy. Amidst this atmosphere of uncertainty, Phoebe's story underwent a significant shift. What had once been a straightforward retelling of events was now mired in doubt and speculation. The community found itself contending with an intricate amount of uncertainties. The mixture of reality and made-up details was like different threads in a puzzle that had created a captivating mystery. From the 16th to the 22nd of July, local individuals were interviewed by authorities, notably Mr. Thomas Coyle and Mrs. Phoebe Campbell. The coroner's inquest convened on the 4th of August, and in the course of the inquiry, the juries gathered at the Campbells' cabin. This enabled them to see the confined area where the assault had occurred. The walls and floor gave an impression that a violent attack had taken place, as there were bloodstains on the floor and the walls. The doctor, named Dr. Moore, who had examined the body following the attack, had noted that the wounds must have been inflicted by a strong man. Phoebe was small, but considered to be stronger than many women her size. The jury at the inquest concluded that Mr. George Campbell had been murdered by two individuals, who they believed to be Mr. Thomas Coyle and George's wife, Mrs. Phoebe Campbell. Phoebe reacted to the accusation by standing up and shouting, "I don't care. I am innocent. I don't care." Following this, Mrs. Phoebe Campbell was arrested and held in prison until her trial that was set for the following spring. The trial commenced on the 1st of April 1872 in London, Ontario, and ushered in a wave of sensationalism that gripped the community in an unprecedented manner. As the prosecution and defence made their opening statements, journalists wrote every word in the knowledge that the public would buy their publications, all eager to read about the drama and the intrigue that was unfolding inside the courtroom. Witnesses who had come to help Phoebe on the night her husband was murdered described the scene in the log cabin to the court. They outlined where the body of Mr. George Campbell lay and the amount of blood that was on the floor and the walls. Phoebe had previously made statements to the police, most of which she had later retracted. She said that her cousin, Mr. John McWayne, had owed her husband money, and as George had asked for it to be paid back, and Mr. McWayne was unable to pay it, he came to the log cabin and murdered him. There was no evidence of this, and of course the accusation was denied by Mr. McWayne. In a startling twist, Phoebe decided to cast a shadow over her late husband's character. She claimed that he had been engaged in an affair with her cousin's wife, a revelation that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. However, the prosecution had their own revelations and introduced a letter that had been written by the defendants to Mr. Thomas Coyle. In the letter, it was evident that her words bore the weight of her emotions. Within its lines, she had written, "I never shall say you done any such thing again, even if I have to die for it." The courtroom atmosphere was tense as this piece of evidence was revealed. During the proceedings, Phoebe's demeanour underwent a perplexing transformation. When queried about the many alterations in her testimony, she strangely reared into the realm of the supernatural. According to her, the ghostly apparition of her deceased husband had graced her with a visitation, absolving both herself and Thomas Coyle of any wrongdoing. Following this statement, there was a murmur from the gallery, but the Crown Attorney's response captured the sentiments of all of those in court when he said, "You can hardly expect anyone to believe such nonsense," his words laden with scepticism. The courtroom was silent for much of the trial, with only the witnesses, barristers, or the judge talking. However, this was shattered as the jury reached their verdict. After only 60 minutes of deliberation, they returned to pronounce the defendant, Mrs. Phoebe Campbell, guilty of the murder of her husband. Tears streamed down her face as the judge delivered her fate. She would be hanged for her crime. She was then returned to prison, where later she made a full confession. She admitted her involvement in the murder, but said that it was Thomas Coyle who attacked George with the axe. She said that they had decided to kill him, as they wanted to get married. She went on to say that on the fateful night, she had left the door open so Thomas could enter the house and attack George while he slept in his bed. But the attack did not go as planned, as George awoke and got up to defend himself. She went on to say that he was eventually overpowered by Thomas Coyle and herself, and Thomas continued to hit him with the axe. Some people believed this statement, others did not, but when Thomas Coyle was sent for trial on the same charge, he was found not guilty. Many consider that the main reason for this was because it had become very difficult to find out what had actually happened that night, due to the many different stories that have been told by Phoebe Campbell. Following his trial, Thomas Coyle left Canada and travelled to England. On Thursday, the 25th of June, 1872, Mrs. Phoebe Campbell was hanged in the city of London in Ontario. Her face marked a grim milestone, establishing her status as the first woman to be executed in post-Confederation Canada. Her name now etched in history forever, intertwined with a tale of betrayal and tragedy. The media portrayed her as a heartless figure, devoid of any remorse. Newspapers reported her demeanour as she had ascended to the gallows. It was written that she had an unwavering expression set against the delicate clutch of a lace handkerchief, which lingered for a fleeting moment after the trapdoor had been sprung. Following the execution, the morbid curiosity of the public was fueled by the production of souvenir postcards. These featured images of the crime, trial and execution, and served as lasting mementos of the tragic events that had shocked 1870s Ontario and is still talked about today.
For case number 3, we go to the USA.
Elizabeth Atherton was born on the 21st of December 1846 in Manchester in England. She was the daughter of Michael Atherton, an engineer, and Jane Bradshaw, a hard-working woman who did her best to provide a modest income for her family. At the time, Manchester was a bustling hub of the Industrial Revolution, characterised by rapid growth in textile manufacturing. The city was marked by crowded living conditions, frequent economic hardships, and a stark divide between the wealthy and the working classes. Education for poorer children in Britain was minimal, typically limited to basic literacy and numeracy skills, acquired at charity schools or through informal learning at home. Like many children in the 1850s, as soon as Elizabeth was old enough, she entered the workforce to help support her family. In her teens, she married Josiah Potts, and soon after she gave birth to a daughter, who they named Alice May. However, Josiah, lured by the promise of better economic prospects in America, steady work, and a more prosperous life, decided to emigrate. Along with his wife and daughter, he boarded the steamship SS City of Cork, which sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, arriving in New York on the 16th of May 1864. At first, they settled in Wisconsin, where over the next few years, Elizabeth gave birth to 7 more children. However, life in the USA was not as easy as Josiah Potts had imagined. Although the years immediately following the Civil War were marked by rapid industrialization and expansion, the 1870s were more difficult, notably the Panic of 1873, which triggered a severe economic depression that lasted for several years. The financial crisis led to widespread bank failures and a slump in construction and production. Although things improved towards the end of the decade, bolstered by continued innovation and westward expansion, which opened new markets and resources. Josiah was a skilled machinist, and due to his previous experience in the factories in Manchester, he secured a position with the Central Pacific Railroad. However, this meant that the family had to move and relocate. They initially settled in Terrace in Utah, before moving to Carlin in Nevada in 1886. Although the couple had 8 children, by this time, most of them had already started to work, or been placed in service for different families in various states. Living with them in Carlin were 2 of their children, 15-year-old Charles and 5-year-old Edith. Josiah worked hard to provide for his family. He was very well liked by the local community and described as a kind and dependable man. His wife, however, had a reputation for being difficult. She was often irritable and demanding, and her temper was quick to flare. Many found her hard to get along with, as she was frequently outspoken and critical. Despite her abrasive nature, those who knew her well understood that she had a strong will and a fierce determination. Some surmised that her tough exterior was sometimes necessary to shield against the hardships they faced. In the mid-1880s, Elizabeth went on a trip to San Francisco, where for some reason she decided to amuse herself by trying to find a husband through a matrimonial agency. She was introduced to a man named Miles Fawcett. He had also come to the USA from Manchester and worked as a carpenter. Mr. Fawcett became infatuated with Elizabeth. He gave her gifts and soon proposed. She accepted and unwittingly entered into a bigamous marriage. Soon after, however, Mr. Fawcett discovered his bride was already married and had a husband who lived in Carlin in Nevada. Now feeling remorseful, Elizabeth told him that she was going to return to Carlin to be with her husband and her children. Not wanting to lose his bride, Mr. Fawcett accompanied her, and Elizabeth invited him to lodge in their house in order to help ease their financial worries. Neither she nor Mr. Fawcett disclosed the nature of their relationship or their bigamous marriage to Mr. Potts. This arrangement carried on for some months until Mr. Fawcett purchased a ranch a few miles outside Carlin. Despite this, he frequently visited Mrs. Potts, who would often cook for him and wash his laundry. This strange situation did cause a few whispers among the neighbours, many of who wondered why Mrs. Potts maintained such a close relationship with Mr. Fawcett while still living with her husband. On the 1st of January 1888, Mr. Fawcett travelled into Carlin from his ranch that was a few miles outside of town. He met up with a friend named Mr. J.P. Linebarger, and together they went to visit Mr. and Mrs. Potts. As they made their way to the Potts' small house, Mr. Fawcett confided in Mr. Linebarger that the couple owed him money. He explained that when he lived with them, they had struggled to pay their rent, so he helped them out. He also mentioned that Mrs. Elizabeth Potts was keen to settle the debt to prevent her husband Josiah from discovering her activities while she was in California. The afternoon passed pleasantly, but as evening approached, it began to rain and darkness set in, so Mrs. Potts invited Mr. Fawcett to spend the night. She advised him not to try and return to his ranch at such a late hour. He accepted her offer, and shortly after, Mr. Linebarger bid farewell and made his way home. 2 weeks later, people began to notice the mysterious absence of Mr. Miles Fawcett. Despite some initial suspicion, the transient nature of Carlin, a town where many came and went, meant that people often lived there for a while, then suddenly left, often without telling anyone where they were going. Nonetheless, Mr. Linebarger approached the Potts family to inquire about his friend's whereabouts. They explained that a disagreement had occurred after Mr. Fawcett had attempted to assault their daughter. They said that when he realised the seriousness of his actions, he decided to head east and sold them his property. Mrs. Potts then produced a bill of sale. Unconvinced by their story, Mr. Linebarger reported the matter to Deputy Sheriff McIntosh. The deputy visited Mr. Fawcett's ranch. When he arrived there, he found the door open and all valuable items gone. While some of his belongings were at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Potts, there was no evidence that anything untoward had happened, so the brief investigation was closed. A few months later, in the summer of 1888, Mr. and Mrs. Potts, along with their 2 children, moved to Rock Springs in Wyoming. They confided to their neighbours about their hopes for a fresh start in a new town. The house they vacated was then rented to Mr. George and Mrs. Amelia Brewer. Mrs. Brewer was someone who professed to have a heightened sensitivity to spiritual phenomena, and while in the house vacated by Mr. and Mrs. Potts, she began reporting sightings of apparitions and hearing eerie sounds, especially in the cellar. So convinced was she by these experiences that she wrote about them in the Elko Free Press. Her article, published on the 5th of January 1889, claimed that the ghost in her house was more active in the cellar, where it frequently knocked over jars of pickles and generally caused a nuisance. Somewhat intrigued, Mrs. Brewer's husband George decided to go into the cellar to see if there was in fact anything causing these strange occurrences. He took with him an iron rod, which he poked into the floor. Some of the ground was soft, and he surmised that it may have been previously dug up. However, he found nothing suspicious, so after a while gave up on his quest. However, the strange noises continued, so a week later he went back to the cellar and once again started digging around. After a while he came across something quite disturbing. At first he thought it was a rotten turnip, but as he pulled at it he realised there was hair, and the smell became quite unbearable. He immediately contacted Deputy George McIntosh, who in turn alerted Sheriff Barnard in Elko. Sheriff Barnard dispatched officers to investigate exactly what or who was beneath the cellar floor. What they found was quite gruesome. The remains of a man who had been brutally dismembered. The skull was charred and partially crushed and bore the marks of a violent end. The features, however, had been obliterated by fire and time. Although formal identification was not possible, there was a knife found in the man's trouser pockets. This was later confirmed to have once belonged to Mr. Miles Fawcett, who had last been seen 12 months previously in the house where the body had been discovered. In the knowledge that at that time Mr. Josiah and Mrs. Elizabeth Potts had been living there, Sheriff Barnard and Constable Joe Triplett set off for Wyoming in order to bring them back to Nevada so they could assist the police with their investigations into the death of Mr. Fawcett. During the long journey back to Carlin, Josiah Potts began to talk. The stress and tension of the situation seemed to weigh on him, and eventually he confessed to the grisly details of what happened on that fateful day. Josiah admitted that he had dismembered and buried Mr. Fawcett's body. He explained that Mr. Fawcett had committed suicide in their house, a tragic and shocking event that left him in a state of panic. Fearing that he would be blamed for the death and subsequently charged with murder, Josiah said that he made a desperate decision to get rid of the body. He told officers that he hoped that by disposing of the evidence, he could avoid any legal consequences and protect his family from scandal and suspicion. As Josiah recounted the events, Sheriff Barnard and Constable Triplett listened intensely, taking note of every detail. But both men wondered if this was actually a true version of what had happened. Josiah and Elizabeth Potts were then charged with murder and placed in jail to await their trial. On the 12th of March 1889, the trial began in front of Judge R.R. Bigelow. There was a great sense of anticipation. The courtroom was filled with an air of tension and curiosity. The mood was charged with expectation, with every eye fixed on the proceedings, waiting to see how the case would unfold and what revelations would come to light. The prosecution's case began with Mr. Linebarger taking the stand as their first witness. He recounted the events leading up to Miles Fawcett's tragic end, recalling how he, along with the deceased man, had visited Mr. and Mrs. Potts' residence on the 1st of January 1888. According to Mr. Linebarger, Mrs. Potts had convinced Mr. Fawcett to stay overnight. It was dark and cold, and Mr. Fawcett decided to accept her offer of hospitality. When asked why he and Mr. Fawcett had gone to the Potts' residence on that particular day, Mr. Linebarger replied that the Potts were in debt to Mr. Fawcett and he wanted to collect the payment. The courtroom fell silent, however, when Mr. Linebarger disclosed that earlier that day he had seen Mr. Fawcett's purse, which contained a substantial amount of gold and money. Next to testify were the Brewers, who recounted the eerie occurrences in their home and detailed the unsettling discovery of a partially burned and dismembered body in their cellar. They shared the chilling sequence of events leading up to the grim find, painting a vivid picture of shock and disbelief that gripped their household. Deputy McIntosh followed, recounting his investigation at the deceased man's ranch. He told the court that there had been no signs of a disturbance, but many items had been removed from the property. District Attorney Love, who was representing the prosecution, skillfully wove these testimonies together. He presented a compelling case against Josiah and Elizabeth Potts in less than 2 days. The evidence he had assembled clearly indicated a motive and an opportunity for the defendants to have committed this most horrible crime. Mr. and Mrs. Potts' teenage son Charlie took the stand as the first witness for the defence. He recounted hearing Ray's voices on the evening of the 1st of January. He said that he got out of bed to investigate. According to Charlie, he opened the kitchen door just as Miles Fawcett shot himself. Disturbed by what he had witnessed, he said that he then went back to bed and insisted that what had happened that evening was never discussed within the family thereafter. When asked if his parents had instructed him to say this in court, he replied that they had not. Elizabeth Potts was the next witness. She was calm, as she explained that Miles Fawcett had come to their home to collect his laundry. As it was New Year's Day, she invited both Mr. Fawcett and Mr. Linebarger inside for a glass of whiskey. She said they all spoke for a while, and after a couple of drinks, Mr. Linebarger departed. But it was what she said next that stunned the courtroom. She looked at the judge, her voice unsteady, yet resolute. She told of how her husband had been searching in her trunk for a postage stamp, but as he rummaged through her belongings, he unexpectedly found an unsent letter that was addressed to Deputy McIntosh, and that she had written a year or so before. He opened it and began to read it. This letter, however, contained a disturbing account from the summer of 1886, which involved Miles Fawcett, who was living in their barn at the time. Elizabeth said that she had written about a day that began with panic when she noticed that her young daughter Edith was missing. She described her frantic search, calling out for Edith and scouring every corner of their home and property. With growing desperation, she finally decided to check the barn and asked Mr. Fawcett if he had seen her daughter. Once there, she saw Edith. She had been taken against her will. Overcome with a mix of emotions, she said that she shouted at Mr. Fawcett, calling him an old wrench and threatening him with severe punishment. As she recounted the incident, her voice started to tremble. She then turned to the jury and described how Mr. Fawcett had reacted very violently. She said he grabbed her, began to choke her, and threatened to kill her if she ever spoke of the incident. She went on to say that she lived in fear of Mr. Fawcett, and due to this continued to occasionally cook for him and do his laundry, never again mentioning what had happened. However, from that day, she never let young Edith out of her sight, and was always very vigilant in order to protect her daughter. Mrs. Potts said that when her husband found the letter, he confronted Mr. Fawcett and threatened to lynch him. In a desperate attempt to save himself, Mr. Fawcett offered to give the Potts everything he owned and promised to leave Carlin. Elizabeth drafted a bill of sale, which Mr. Fawcett signed, but her husband Josiah threw it down, declaring that he did not want Mr. Fawcett's money or property. As the courtroom remained silent, Elizabeth maintained a calm but serious tone, while she described the shocking climax of the confrontation. She said that Mr. Fawcett grabbed a revolver from the shelf, held it on the left side of his head, and said, "You folks will be blamed for this." He then pulled the trigger. Elizabeth went on to say that she looked at her husband in disbelief, but he told her to go to bed, assuring her that he would sort everything out. When Josiah took the stand, he confirmed his wife's account and described how when alone with Mr. Fawcett's lifeless body, he wrestled with the fear of being blamed for his death, so made the decision to conceal it. He said that he carefully wrapped the deceased man in blankets and then carried the body to the cellar, placing it in a shallow grave. Josiah went on to say that as months passed, he became anxious that the body may be discovered, so he dug it up and attempted to dispose of it. He briefly looked at the floor before saying that in desperation, he began to cut the body into pieces. First, he removed the head and feet and crushed the skull. He had planned to burn it, but as the body parts began to smell, he stopped and reburied them instead. He stressed that his wife had nothing to do with the handling of the body and said that they took no personal belongings or money from the deceased. When the trial ended, the judge summed up the case and the jury was sent out to deliberate. They did so for 4 hours before returning to find both the accused guilty of murder. A collective gasp filled the room, followed by a heavy silence as the weight of the verdict settled in. The judge then sentenced Josiah Potts and his wife Elizabeth to death. The sentence and verdict were appealed to the Supreme Court, which granted a stay of execution. However, after their review, the original sentence and verdict were upheld. Still convinced that the Potts were innocent, 267 Carlin residents signed a petition and presented it to the Board of Pardons. Even Judge Bigelow, who had handed down the original death sentence, and Deputy Sheriff Dowley made an appeal to try and get the sentence overturned. However, all of these appeals were denied. Meanwhile, Mr. and Mrs. Potts remained in Elko jail. The agonising wait for the execution became unbearable for Elizabeth. It slowly eroded her composure, and each passing moment seemed to stretch into an eternity as the weight of her impending doom pressed heavily upon her. This increased as a gallows for the hanging were built behind the Elko courthouse, and during their construction, all the noise could be heard from her cell. Quite desperate, she somehow managed to conceal a small knife on her person, and as her state of despair continued, she tried to take her own life, but she was quickly spotted by a guard, and her attempt was unsuccessful. At 10:30 a.m. on Friday the 20th of June 1890, officers gave the condemned couple a drink. Before Reverend Porter said a prayer, Mrs. Potts raised her hand and declared their innocence as the death warrants were read. 52 witnesses were present, all of whom were men, as no women were permitted to attend. After another drink, they calmly walked to the gallows. Elizabeth wore a white dress with black bows, and Josiah was dressed in a suit. They were bound, shoeless, and shared a final kiss before black hoods and nooses were placed over them. In a soft voice, Josiah repeatedly said, "Lord, have mercy on me," while Elizabeth pleaded, "Lord, have mercy on my soul." The trap door was then opened, and Mr. Josiah and Mrs. Elizabeth Potts were hanged. They were laid to rest side by side in Potter's Field, not far from the grave of Miles Fawcett, the man who they had been convicted of killing. After the hanging, their son Charles moved away, while their young daughter Edith was adopted by a local couple. It is reported that Edith later confided that she had seen her mother shoot Miles Fawcett while her father was out.
For the final case, we go to Australia.
Jane McManaman was born in Ireland in 1833, and by the time she reached the age of 22, the world around her had already changed dramatically. In 1855, she and her sister Margaret, just 1 year younger, made the decision to leave their homeland and sail to South Australia. Theirs was not an unusual story, as the 1850s saw a wave of young Irish women migrating to Australia, driven by the harsh realities of life in post-famine Ireland, which had caused widespread poverty, starvation and despair. For young women like Jane and Margaret, opportunities were scarce, and the future seemed bleak. Meanwhile, across the seas, the colony of South Australia, with its wide open spaces and growing towns, was in desperate need of women in order to help with the labour shortages in both domestic service and rural industries, as well as to rectify the significant gender imbalance that had been caused by the earlier waves of predominantly male immigrants. Both sisters initially found employment with Leonard Lovegrove at the Poltalloch Station, a sprawling property situated on the shores of Lake Alexandrina. Jane worked there for over 2 years, before moving on to work for a gentleman named William Carter in the nearby town of Wellington. Mr. Carter served as both postmaster and ferry keeper, and played a key role in the town, which was an important ferry crossing point for people, livestock and goods travelling overland between Adelaide and Melbourne. Jane developed a close bond with Mr. Carter. She entrusted him with her savings, £50, a significant amount at the time, and also with a few of her personal possessions, some of which held great emotional value to her. However, Jane did have a reputation for her frugality and careful money management, and this was often commented upon by those who knew her. Around 1857, Jane left the employment of Mr. Carter and took a job working for Mrs. Catherine Robinson, the owner of an inn called the Traveller's Rest in Salt Creek, a small settlement along the Coorong, about 66 miles from Wellington. Mrs. Robinson was a widow, her husband having died under mysterious circumstances in June 1856. A local man named Malachi Martin was apprehended as a suspect. He was someone with a checkered past. He had been born in Ireland in 1831, but in 1837, when he was just 6 years old, he travelled along with his parents to South Australia, eventually settling in a district just south of Adelaide. And when he was a teenager, he was charged with theft while working in a post office in Encounter Bay. He was tried, but found not guilty. However, just 6 days later, tragedy struck his family when his mother drowned in a pond near to their house. At the subsequent inquest, it was ruled that she had taken her own life while labouring under temporary insanity, likely caused by the emotional toll of her son's criminal trial. To compound the tragedy, she was heavily pregnant at the time. There were some locals, however, who questioned this verdict. A few years later, Malachi Martin and his father moved to a farm near the Coorong. He worked there and also drove the mail coach between Adelaide and Melbourne. Salt Creek was a stopping point, and he became acquainted with William and Catherine Robinson. However, as he stopped there more often, rumours circulated that he and Catherine were involved in an improper relationship. Mr. Robinson was not fond of Mr. Martin, although he welcomed his custom. In June 1856, the two men went into the bush together in search of scrub cattle, but only Malachi Martin returned. A search party was organised to find Mr. Robinson, with Mr. Martin assisting. Shortly after, Mr. Robinson's body was discovered near the edge of a swamp. His throat had been slashed. He was found lying face down with a knife in his right hand, in spite of the fact that Mr. Robinson was left-handed. Although Malachi Martin was a suspect in the murder, the case against him was soon dropped. He then left the region and went to live in Sydney. He stayed there for 2 years, but returned in 1858, wherein a surprising turn of events. He and Catherine Robinson married in June of the same year. This only increased the speculation regarding the circumstances surrounding Mrs. Robinson's husband's death. Life had somewhat changed for Jane. She was no longer working for Mrs. Catherine Robinson, who following her second marriage was now Mrs. Catherine Martin. It seemed to Jane that Mrs. Martin's husband Malachi was the one in charge of the inn. Jane found him to be a brutish type of character, aggressive and selfish, with little concern for anyone but himself. His words were often blunt, and his actions reflected his disregard for how they affected others. However, despite his outward demeanour, there were moments when she glimpsed something deeper, perhaps a hint of sadness or regret hidden beneath his tough exterior. Jane's weekly wage was 11 shillings, with food and accommodation included. Due to this, and the rural environment where she lived, she found little need for day-to-day spending. As a result, she rarely took the money she earned for her hard work, and instead asked Mr. Martin to look after it for her. He was happy to do this, and assured her that the money was safe with him, and that he would give it to her whenever she was in need of it. Over time, her earnings quietly accumulated, but Jane, with simple needs and frugal habits, rarely gave the matter much thought. It seemed to be an arrangement that suited them both. She frequently wrote to her sister Margaret, sharing news and updates. However, in February 1862, the letters suddenly stopped. By April, Margaret had grown increasingly anxious. She had always worried about Jane, and had harboured doubts about Mr. Malachi Martin. She knew from the letters that her sister had not been particularly fond of him, and now, troubled by Jane's silence and not knowing what to do, Margaret contacted Mr. William Carter, who was her sister's previous employer, and confided in him her concerns about Jane's well-being. Mr. Carter immediately began making inquiries about her whereabouts, speaking with anyone who he thought might have seen or heard from Jane. However, despite his best efforts, there was no trace of the young lady. He then decided to contact the police. Officer William Rollinson from the Wellington Police Station was assigned to lead the investigation. At first, he approached the case as a routine missing persons inquiry, hoping that Jane had simply gone off on her own for a while. He spoke to Mr. Malachi Martin, the innkeeper, but he just told Mr. Rollinson that she had not simply vanished, and that there was nothing mysterious about her absence. He claimed that back in February, a group of Jane's friends had stopped at the Traveller's Rest. While heading south, he claimed that Jane had decided on the spur of the moment to join them, at least as far as Maria Creek, a stop along their routes. He said that she had told him that once there, she had planned to continue to her sister's residence on foot, which was apparently nearby. Malachi Martin's story, though simple and reassuring on the surface, did little to quell the unease of William Rollinson and his fellow officers. The timeline that Mr. Martin had provided seemed vague, and no one could confirm having seen Jane since that day. Her friends, whom Mr. Martin had mentioned, had not been identified, and the route she supposedly took was long and isolated. In fact, his explanation raised more questions than answers. As weeks passed, the police grew more convinced that something far more sinister had taken place. Doubts about Malachi Martin's accounts deepened, and officers began to suspect that Jane had never in fact left the inn that day. Their focus shifted from a simple disappearance to uncovering the dark truth that might lie within the walls of the Traveller's Rest. When they searched the inn, they found Jane's knitting discarded in the kitchen and a pair of her shoes in the room she used to occupy. They also discovered that Mrs. Catherine Martin was wearing 2 rings that are identified to have belonged to Jane. By late May, Officer Rollinson's suspicions about Mr. Martin had grown significantly, prompting him to take the unusual step of deploying an undercover officer at the inn. Disguised as a guest, the officer's mission was to discreetly observe Mr. and Mrs. Martin and any other patrons, in the hope of uncovering any clues as to what had happened to Miss Jane McManaman. However, despite the officer's efforts, an unsettling silence surrounded the case. No one spoke of Jane, and any attempt to gather information seemed to lead to dead ends. This only deepened the mystery into the young lady's disappearance. On the 29th of May, a native Australian known as Mickey brought alarming news to William Allen, a resident of Wood Wells, a secluded place located about 11 miles north of Salt Creek. Mickey informed Mr. Allen that the body of a young woman had been found by someone he knew. It had been concealed and partially buried in a wombat hole, approximately half a mile from the Traveller's Rest. Upon learning of this grim discovery, Mr. Allen acted quickly and sent an urgent message to the nearest police station. This was received by a police trooper, who immediately relayed the information to his superiors at police headquarters. However, recognising the seriousness of the situation, the police trooper also saddled his horse and rode to Wellington, personally informed Senior Officer Rollinson about the discovery. Soon police arrived at the place where the body was found and exhumed it from its makeshift grave, carefully transporting it to Wood Wells for an official inquest. This was held on the 2nd of June, and the body was soon identified to be the missing young woman, Miss Jane McManaman. William Allen, who had first received the news from Mickey, took it upon himself to make a coffin for Jane. He then buried her on top of a hill, about 200 metres from his house. However, the Crown Solicitor, recognising the need for thoroughness in such a serious case, ordered that the body be disinterred for further examination, as it was deemed essential that a qualified medical expert should conduct a thorough autopsy and establish the exact cause of death. Dr. Goss, a respected physician, was summoned from Adelaide specifically for this purpose. After a careful and methodical examination, he announced that Jane McManaman had died due to strangulation. The evidence now pointed in the direction of Malachi Martin, making him the prime suspect. He was the last person to have seen the young lady alive. The proximity of his home to the body's burial site was unmistakable, and his claim that Jane had left with friends had never been seen as credible. The inquest concluded that Malachi Martin should face trial on the charge of willful murder. The case drew considerable public and press attention. It was not only a tale of violence, but also one of betrayal, deceit, and the painstaking efforts to bring justice to a remote corner of the country. The trial was due to begin on the 20th of August 1862. A key witness in the case was William Wilson, a carpenter who, along with Jane, had often worked for Malachi Martin at the Traveller's Rest. Mr. Wilson had initially told police that on the day Jane vanished, Mr. Martin had sent him on an errand to a station about 20 miles from Salt Creek. However, while en route to Adelaide to testify at the trial, Mr. Wilson stopped in Wellington. There, after a night of heavy drinking, he told the publican, Mr. William Butcher, that he had seen Jane's dead body in Salt Creek. His statement caused quite a stir and directly contradicted his earlier testimony that he had no knowledge of her fate. When the authorities were informed of his drunken confession, they became suspicious, as it implied that he may have been more involved in Jane's disappearance than initially thought. Mr. Wilson was then arrested as an accessory to the crime, which led to the postponement of the trial and further heightened uncertainty surrounding the case. His arrest cast new doubts on his involvement in Jane's disappearance, complicating the investigation even more. The delay, coupled with shifting suspicions, only deepened the confusion over the true circumstances of Jane's fate. While in prison, Mr. Wilson made yet another startling claim. He revealed that shortly before Jane's disappearance, he had proposed to her, and she had accepted. He went on to say that the only person who he had shared this information with was Malachi Martin. It was uncertain as to whether in this confession Mr. Wilson was telling the truth, or it was just yet another fabrication, but it added even more complexity to his already dubious credibility. The trial finally commenced on the 2nd of December 1862, with both men pleading not guilty. if William Wilson's claims were true, it suggested that Mr. Martin might have killed Jane to avoid paying her 2 years' wages. However, Mr. Wilson was considered by most to be an unreliable person. One witness, named Peter Nichols, who drove the mail coach between Adelaide and Melbourne, told the court that he had seen Jane at the inn on the 2nd of February and that she seemed to be in good spirits. He said that 6 days later, on his return, he passed William Wilson about a quarter of a mile along the road from the inn. He added that when he arrived at the Traveller's Rest, he knocked on the door, but no one answered. Then, after some delay, Mr. Martin opened up and let him in. He said that Mrs. Martin was not present, so he assisted Malachi in preparing the evening meal, and that later they were joined by a man named Mr. Stockdale, and the three of them ate together. He went on to say that during the meal, Mr. Martin informed him that Jane had left his employment, claiming that she had run away in a covered wagon that was heading towards Mount Gambier. What Mr. Nichols said next caused a deep sense of unease to settle over the courts. He recalled that on his way to the Traveller's Rest, he had seen a covered wagon at the Rankine station, which was located between Salt Creek and Mount Gambier. He had spoken with the people in the wagon, but he neither saw Jane nor heard any mention of her. He also expressed confusion over Mr. Martin's claim that Jane had just suddenly gone off. He said that he had known her for 2 years and knew that Mr. Martin owed her more than £50 in wages. He said that in his opinion, it made no sense that she would just leave, and he thought that if she had just gone anywhere, it would have been to see Mr. Carter to collect the remainder of her money, especially as some of her friends worked for him. When William Wilson gave evidence, he told the court that on the day Jane disappeared, he had gone to Stephen Hack's station to get a saddle, and upon his return, he was informed that Jane had left with friends for Mount Gambier. He said that initially he wasn't suspicious, as Jane had sometimes mentioned going there for the higher wages available. The court then fell silent when Mr. Wilson said that he had seen Jane's body after her death. He explained that Malachi Martin later confessed to him that he had killed her and then threatened to finish him off if he said anything. He had kept this information to himself until he finally confided in Mr. Butcher, the publican at Wellington. Mr. Carter was another witness. He informed the court that shortly before her death, Jane had told him that she had £70 in savings, which was being looked after by Mr. Martin. He added that he knew that she was contemplating returning to Ireland and wanted to take the money back with her. Malachi Martin chose not to testify and instead maintained his story that Jane had left impulsively with friends, despite her promising not to depart before his wife Catherine had returned. When the trial ended, he was found guilty for Jane's murder and was subsequently sentenced to death. William Wilson was found guilty of an accessory after the fact and sentenced to 4 years hard labour. Malachi Martin was hanged at Adelaide Jail on the 24th of December 1862. Before his execution, he made only one statement. He said that William Wilson had never seen Jane's body at Salt Creek and that he had made the whole thing up. Following the hanging, he was buried within the jail grounds. After the authorities had conducted the autopsy on Jane's body, she had again been buried at Woodwells, the place where William Allen had originally laid her to rest. In the 1920s, there are reports of a jam tin marking her grave, and later, a stone cairn was erected. Sadly, however, by the mid-20th century, the exact location of the grave had been forgotten. Fortunately, it was rediscovered in 1966 by a government surveyor and 2 local men named Alan Johnson and Arthur Reed, who confirmed the actual location where Jane had been buried by digging until they found her bones. In 1972, a concrete headstone was then placed at the burial sites and a memorial service was held. Although the grave is on private property, the fenced area can still be seen from the highway by anyone who passes through Woodwells.
Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case